So, Nils Lofgren found some time between E Street Band and Crazy Horse and whatever other duties that he fills his life with. And now he's released a new solo album. It's titled Mountains. It's been out for a few weeks, and Bob has some opinions about it. Take it away, Bobby.
All right. Hey there. Thanks, Scotty. Yeah, 72-year-old Nils Lofgren found some inspiration during the pandemic lockdown. And like a lot of us, Nils had to put everything on hold, to go into seclusion. And so this was quite a departure for him because Nils has been a very, very busy musician throughout his career. And sidelined by the pandemic, he's sitting at home, time on his hands. So he said, he was sitting around in his garage studio, just kind of playing his guitar along with other recordings, and decided, well, let's take my time and create some new music. So he started writing music, and that's how he spent his pandemic lockdown. Now, before I get into this album, for those of you who may not be necessarily aware of Nils, I want to cover his background a little bit because it's kind of impressive. Nils Lofgren has been a member of two of probably the more iconic bands in rock and roll history. He started out as a member of Crazy Horse, recording some early stuff with Neil Young. And then in 1984, he became a member of Bruce Springsteen's E Street Band. So those are two pretty heavy-duty groups to be in. In between that, he had a solo career with his own band called Grin. And so guy's been around a lot. He's a veteran musician and great guitarist and really good at what he does. So anyway, sitting at home, he starts creating music, does a lot of the stuff on this album on his own. He did bring in a few session musicians to help out, but a lot of the instrumentation on here, he just did by himself. He had an engineer friend of his come over, and that was about the only person that showed up, and they masked up and tried to be as safe as they could, by making this album. Now, he does have some pretty interesting guest artists on here. One of them is a drummer you may have heard of named Ringo Starr, from the Beatles. And then he's got Neil Young singing background vocals with him on a song, and David Crosby. Now, so what's significant about this? This may well be the last album where Neil Young and David Crosby perform on the same album. Now, they didn't perform together, and they both did their stuff remotely, because Lofgren sent the tapes to them, they added their vocals and then sent them back. But still, it does have those two longtime collaborators, frenemies for a while, actually performing together on the same album. So it may well be the last one that you'll ever hear that. There are two cuts on this album that really stand out to me. One of them is the opening song, which is called Ain't the Truth Enough. And this song has got a really good hook to it. It's written from the perspective of a wife confronting her husband upon his return for participating in the January 6th insurrection in Washington, D.C. And Lofgren says he was inspired to write this by his wife, who's a very, activist and everything. And he said that she's a, fierce fighter for women's rights, kids' rights, human rights, et cetera, et cetera. And so he wrote the song from the perspective of the wife confronting her husband, and it's saying, isn't the truth enough for you? And some lyrics from this. Who filled your head with lies? You were Kool-Aid hypnotized. So very cool song, got a neat hook to it, very topical. So that song is worth the price of admission to this album alone. Then he's got another song on here that is a tribute to the late drummer for the Rolling Stones, Charlie Watts, and it's called Won't Cry No More. And Lofgren, was acquainted with the Rolling Stones. He's got a nice blues riff on this song. And this one I really like. That was a standout to me also. He's got the song called Nothing's Easy. That's the one where Neil Young sings with him. And he said he'd been waiting for years to find a song that he could do with Young. And So he sent this one to him, and Neil said, yeah, hey, this feels good, let's do it. So Neil Young sings harmony on that one. Lofgren covers a Springsteen tune called Back in Your Arms. The closing tune on this album is called, let me get my note, Angel Blues. And this is another one that I thought was kind of a standout. And it's a bookend to the opening song of, Ain't the Truth Enough for You. And this one is kind of an uplifting song. And Lofgren says it's an old song that he had been working on in the past that was unfinished. So he decided to get into this thing and finish it. And it's a nice way of wrapping up this album. And the opening lines are really, really neat. It's lean your weary halo on my wing and let peace come. As your darkness dies in my light, even angels falter now and then. And Lofgren talks about how he used to be a Catholic. He's lost his faith. He's lost his religion. So he says he now looks at all religions as cults. So he says, I believe in a higher power, but it just may necessarily be, the Christian God that so many other people are following. So those are three cuts that I mentioned that I really like. There is a vibe to this album that I like, and it has an unhurried, laid-back feel to it. You can sense in it that here's a guy who has got lots of time now. He's in the twilight of his life. He's sitting there reflecting, thinking about things, and he's just unhurriedly making music. And for the first time in his life, he's got the time to do this because of this forced isolation. So it's easy to listen to, and it flows well, and you can just sit back and kind of let it wash over you because you get that vibe. That is also the bad thing about this album, that it doesn't really kick you in the teeth, okay? It is a little too laid back, and it's not really a memorable album. It's okay, it's good, but it's not something that I don't think we're going to be listening to decades later. It's not going to be held up as a classic rock album like A Hard Day's Night is or anything like that. So it's good yeoman work. If we were back several decades ago, back when you had to buy physical music to have it in your collection, and I had listened to this in advance, would I spend money on it? Probably not. Would I listen to it now since it's on streaming and I'm already paying for the streaming and it's not costing me anything other than my time? Yeah. So I would recommend you check it out, specifically for the three songs that I mentioned: the opening track, the closing track, and the tribute to Charlie Watts. I thought those were three good tracks. The rest of it, it's kind of meh, it's okay, but it just doesn't necessarily inspire me. The songs are relatively well written, but it's just a little too laid back for my taste, if that makes sense. So yeah, I would recommend you listen to it. Maybe you will find it to be more inspiring than I did. Check out those three tracks for sure. It's worth listening to. Is it worth spending money on a CD from Nils? Sorry, Nils, no, I can't recommend it that far. But it's not a bad effort. It's not horrible. Give it a listen. You might like it.
That assessment you had of this album, I have heard one Nils Lofgren solo album, and this is 30 years ago. I'll just go and find it. It was called Silver Lining from 1991. And from what I remember from that album, I bought it. I bought the CD, and I listened to it for a while, and it was like the same assessment. I remember the same assessment you had. It's like, well, it's just kind of there. It never really kicks into gear. It's kind of pleasant, but it's not very memorable, and yada yada yada. The same thing. In fact, to the point where I actually owned this and listened to it a while. I had to go scrambling through Wikipedia to try to figure out what which album it was. So, yeah. 30 years later, and it sounds like he made the same album that he made in 1991.
I had not thought about that, but I think you've got a really good point. I have an old Nils Lofgren live album, and that I bought a long time ago, and kind of the same thing back then. I listened to it a couple times, but I never really went back to it. Now, I like his work as a guitarist. He did great work with Crazy Horse, and I've seen him perform live, a couple times with the E Street Band. He's a hell of a good guitarist, maybe on his own, not quite so much.
Yeah, he's a guy who's a collaborator and not a front man, I guess. There's a lesson that we're learning here from these two albums in the last 30 years.
That reminds me, something else to throw out real quick. Thought he was a little weak on vocals. He's not necessarily the greatest singer around. And
competent is what I remember.
Yeah, competent. Yeah. And like I say, there are a couple times when he does stand out on this. Won't Cry No More. That was a good blues tune. He unpacked some good blues riffs on that Charlie Watts tribute. And the opening track had some life to it. But after that, it just, to me, was just kind of like pedestrian, I guess. It's okay, but it just didn't light my fire.
So is this pretty much, are we at the end of these pandemic albums?
Good question, because, we've been out of the pandemic lockdown now for at least a year, maybe more. So I don't know if we're going to see any pandemic stuff coming out or not, but,
yeah.
And it'll be interesting sometime when we have some distance and perspective on this to see if there's any kind of a trend to these pandemic albums, because how many of them have been literally solo efforts, where somebody locks themselves into a studio and did everything on their own, and then if they needed help, they would just send the tapes out to somebody else who would play on it remotely and send it back.
Right. Well, there were a lot of those. Didn't you recently review Edgar Winter album where he did that, the tribute to Johnny Winter? Wasn't that something like that?
Yeah, I think maybe it might have been, but I actually liked that.
And I know that yes, the album The Quest from a year or two ago, it was done like that, where they were all separate and just exchanged digital files, and Steve Howe compiled it all together. Well, there you have it, everybody. Nils Lofgren, Mountains. Hope you enjoyed the review. Hit that subscribe button, and we will talk to you soon. So long.
Take care.
Now you got the right to sing the old man blues. They're trading your Playboy for some hush puppy shoes. One more time.